Sometimes salvation arrives in a dark green suit. A little girl burst into the Golden Lotus restaurant, her yellow dress stained with dirt, her voice breaking with every word. Please, please help her. The finest crystal stopped mid-clink. Every conversation died. And every eye turned to watch as she threw herself at the sleeve of Sang-min, a man whose name made hardened criminals cross the street. But on this night, something happened that no one in that room would ever forget. This is a story about the moment one child's courage collided with one man's buried conscience. And trust me, you need to hear what happened next. Her tiny shoes slapped against marble. Every step echoed through the luxury restaurant like a countdown to disaster. Tears carved streaks through the dirt on her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps that made grown men uncomfortable. "They're hurting my mom," she screamed, and the room went silent. But the man she ran toward wasn't just any diner. He was Sang-min, the most feared Korean underworld boss in the city. And what he did next would prove that even the coldest heart can crack. Stay until the end, because this story will remind you that redemption often wears the most unexpected face. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. It's a humid Thursday evening in downtown Seoul, 2019. The Golden Lotus restaurant hummed with the particular energy that only came when powerful men gathered in expensive spaces. This wasn't a place for tourists or first dates. This was where deals were made in whispers, where alliances were forged over aged whiskey, and where the city's underground elite conducted business behind a curtain of perfect service and strategic silence. Every waiter knew the golden rule: see nothing, hear nothing, speak nothing. Every guest understood the unspoken contract. You respected the space. You minded your business. And you never, ever, caused a disruption. Sang-min sat at his usual corner table, a commanding presence even in stillness. At 41, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 districts, his influence touching everything from real estate to nightlife to the political machinery that kept the city running. His dark eyes missed nothing. His tailored dark green suit and gold chain spoke of wealth earned through methods polite society pretended not to understand. Tonight, like every Thursday for the past 8 years, he was conducting his weekly strategy session with his key operators. The conversation flowed in controlled tones, numbers discussed, territories evaluated, problems addressed with surgical efficiency. This was how Sang-min operated. Methodical. Calculated. Emotion locked away where it couldn't cloud judgment. He had survived in this world longer than most because he understood one fundamental truth: sentiment was a liability. Care about someone, and your enemies would use them against you. Show weakness, and the wolves would circle. So Sang-min had built walls. High ones. Thick ones. Walls that had kept him alive and powerful for 2 decades. But walls, no matter how strong, can crumble. And tonight, they would. The restaurant's heavy oak door suddenly burst open with enough force to rattle the frame. Every head swiveled. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the soft piano music seemed to fade into shocked silence. The maitre d' rushed forward, his face pale with alarm. But before he could intercept the intruder, everyone saw what had caused the commotion. A little girl, no more than 7 years old, stood trembling in the doorway. Her yellow dress was torn and filthy. Dirt streaked her face. Her straw hairband hung crooked, barely clinging to tangled dark hair. One knee was scraped and bleeding, a bright red contrast against her small leg. But it was her eyes that stopped everyone cold. Wide. Desperate. Searching. The restaurant's elite patrons stared back in varying degrees of discomfort and annoyance. Some looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the disruption. Others whispered behind their hands, irritated that their evening had been interrupted by what they assumed was some street child looking for handouts or attention. But the little girl wasn't looking for money. She was looking for salvation. Her gaze swept the room frantically, taking in the expensive suits, the glittering jewelry, the faces of men who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. And then her eyes locked onto Sang-min's table. Maybe it was the way the other men deferred to him. Maybe it was the expensive suit or the gold chain that caught the low light. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper. A child's pure instinct recognizing the one person in that room who possessed the power to actually do something. Without hesitation, she ran straight toward him. The room held its collective breath. Sangmin's bodyguards instantly tensed, hands moving toward their jackets in practiced reflex. This was unprecedented. No one approached Sangmin uninvited. Not business partners. Not rival bosses. And certainly not children. But before anyone could react, the little girl reached his table and grabbed his sleeve with both trembling hands. Her tiny fingers clutched the expensive fabric like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world. And then she spoke the words that would echo in Sangmin's mind for the rest of his life. "They're hurting my mom. Please, please help her." The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Every eye in the Golden Lotus fixed on Sangmin, waiting to see how the notorious crime boss would handle this impossible situation. His reputation had been built on being untouchable. Unfeeling. A man who showed mercy to no one unless it served his interests. Sangmin looked down at the child clinging to his arm. Her face was turned up toward his, those brown eyes wide with a desperate hope that had no business existing in someone so young. Her bottom lip trembled. Tears continued to stream down her cheeks, cutting paths through the grime. In that moment, something shifted deep in the hardened criminal's chest. Something he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Something that felt dangerously like humanity. The rain had started while they were inside, a cold drizzle that turned Seoul's backstreets into rivers of neon reflection and shadow. Sarah's small hand gripped Sangmin's with surprising strength as she led him away from the Golden Lotus, her feet splashing through puddles without hesitation. "This way," she whispered, pulling him down an alley most people avoided after dark. Sangmin's men flanked them, silent, efficient, hands resting near concealed weapons. But tonight they weren't protecting their boss from rivals or police. Tonight, they were following a 7-year-old girl through the maze of Seoul's underbelly, searching for a woman bleeding out in the dark. The smell hit them first. Rotting trash mixed with rainwater and something else, something metallic that Sangmin recognized immediately. Blood. Fresh and still flowing. Flickering streetlights cast everything in stuttering illumination, turning the alley into a strobe of horror. Broken bottles. Scattered newspapers dissolving in dirty puddles. Overflowing dumpsters creating shadows where anything, or anyone, could hide. And
Funka,
there,
wake
crumpled
up,
against
please.
the wet concrete behind
Here,
a
take
rusted
this.
market stall,
Funka, can
lay
you hear
Funk.
me?
Sarah's mother. She was curled on her side, one arm wrapped protectively around her ribs, the other stretched out as if reaching for help that never came. Her face was bruised, swollen around the left eye. Her lip had been split, blood mixing with rain on her dark skin. Her breathing came in shallow, painful gasps, the kind that spoke of broken ribs and internal damage. "Mama." Sarah's voice cracked as she released Sangmin's hand and ran to her mother's side. "Baby." Funk's whisper was barely audible. "You came back. I found help, Mama. I found someone strong." Sangmin stood frozen for 3 full seconds, longer than he'd paused in the face of danger in 20 years. Something about the scene before him short-circuited the careful emotional distance he'd maintained for decades. A mother. A child. Violence without purpose or profit. Just cruelty for cruelty's sake. He moved then, his expensive leather shoes splashing through filthy water as he knelt beside Funk. Up close, he could see more damage, defensive wounds on her forearms, bruising around her throat where someone had grabbed her, dirt ground into her torn clothing. Without a word, Sangmin removed his dark green suit jacket, the one that had cost more than most people earned in a month, and draped it gently over Funk's trembling shoulders. "You're safe now," he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that made it feel like truth. Funk's eyes fluttered open, confusion and pain warring in her expression. "Who?" "Don't talk," Sangmin instructed, already pulling out his phone. "Save your strength. He dialed with controlled precision, his tone shifting into something harder, more commanding. Hyun-woo. I need you at the alley behind the Mapo Market. Now. Bring emergency medical equipment, possible broken ribs, head trauma, internal bleeding. Private transport to the clinic. No hospitals, no questions, no paperwork trail. 10 minutes, boss, came the efficient reply. Hello friends, you've watched this far, don't be one of those people who enjoy and disappear. Subscribe, like, and let me know where you're watching from. This channel survives because of people like you, so please subscribe, like, and join the family. I truly appreciate every single one of you. Let's continue our amazing story. Sang-min ended the call and turned to Sarah, who was clutching her mother's hand and crying softly. Sarah, I need you to be brave one more time. Can you tell me exactly what the men who did this looked like? The little girl wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her voice steadying as she focused on helping her mother. One had a tattoo, a snake, right here. She pointed to her own neck. The other wore bright red shoes. Shiny ones. Sang-min's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His men noticed, they always noticed when their boss went dangerously quiet. He knew exactly who she was describing. Sang-ho and Young-min, low-level loan sharks who operated in the district, squeezing small business owners and street vendors for protection money they could barely afford. Sang-min had heard their names before, always associated with petty violence and intimidation. But this crossed a line that even the underworld recognized. You didn't beat mothers unconscious in front of their children. You didn't leave women bleeding in alleys over pocket change. There were rules, even in their world. And these two animals had broken every single one. In the distance, Sang-min could hear the approaching wail of a private ambulance. Hyun-woo always delivered. But as he watched Sarah press her small face against her mother's shoulder, whispering promises that everything would be okay now, something fundamental shifted in Sang-min's carefully controlled universe. This wasn't business anymore. This wasn't about territory or respect or maintaining order. This was personal. And Sang-ho and Young-min were about to learn the difference. The ambulance lights painted the alley in flashes of red and white as Sang-min stood,
we have to
rain
go now.
dripping from his hair,
but I'm
his
scared.
expensive jacket still covering a stranger's broken body. He made a silent vow in that moment, one he intended to keep with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything else in his world. There would be consequences. The private medical clinic erupted into controlled chaos the moment they arrived. Nurses in crisp white uniforms moved with practiced urgency, their soft-soled shoes squeaking against polished floors. Medical equipment beeped and hummed. Overhead lights cast everything in harsh, clinical white. Funk was rushed through double doors that swung shut with finality, separating mother from daughter in one efficient motion. Sarah stood frozen in the waiting area, her small frame shaking, though whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion, Sang-min couldn't tell. Probably all three. Her yellow dress was still damp from the rain, her scraped knee still bleeding sluggishly, her eyes fixed on those closed doors as if she could will them to reopen through sheer determination. Sang-min's men positioned themselves strategically around the clinic, outside, in the lobby, near exits. Creating a perimeter. Ensuring privacy. This was what they did. Protect. Control. Secure. But Sang-min himself stayed beside the little girl. He pulled a chair next to hers and sat down, his large frame somehow making the waiting room furniture look fragile and temporary. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant beeping of monitors and Sarah's occasional sniffles. Is my mama going to die? The question came out so quietly Sang-min almost missed it. Sarah didn't look at him when she asked. Just kept staring at those doors, her small hands twisted together in her lap. Sang-min could have lied. Could have offered empty reassurances that meant nothing. But something about this child, her courage, her desperation, her terrible hope, demanded honesty. Your mother is strong, he said carefully. And she's getting the best care available. But right now, she needs you to be strong too. Sarah's bottom lip trembled. I tried to stop them. I screamed at them to leave her alone. But they just laughed. A memory flashed through Sangmin's mind, unbidden and unwelcome. He was 8 years old again, sitting in a hospital waiting room not so different from this one. His own mother lay behind similar doors, her body broken from exhaustion, malnutrition, and a factory accident that never should have happened. He remembered screaming for help that never came. Remembered the cold indifference of adults who saw just another poor kid with another dying parent. Remembered the moment he'd promised himself that if he ever had power, he would never let anyone feel that helpless again. He'd broken that promise somewhere along the way. Let the pursuit of power become the point itself rather than the tool. Until tonight. You did everything right, Sangmin said quietly. You were brave when most adults would have run away. A nurse appeared with a small first aid kit and gently cleaned Sarah's scraped knee. The little girl barely seemed to notice, her attention divided between those closed doors and the strange, dangerous man who'd chosen to stay with her. After the nurse left, Sarah pulled a slightly crushed piece of paper and some crayons from her dress pocket, things she must have grabbed before running for help. With trembling hands, she began to draw. Sangmin watched as an image took shape, a simple figure of a woman surrounded by colorful flowers, a bright sun overhead, and a small girl holding her hand. This is my mama, Sarah whispered. She sells flowers at the market. She says flowers make people happy even on sad days. She finished the drawing and held it out to Sangmin. Can you keep it safe? Until mama can see it? Sangmin took the paper carefully, as if it were something precious and fragile. Which, he supposed, it was. He folded it once and placed it in his inner jacket pocket, right over his heart. I promise, he said. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, Hyunwoo emerged through the double doors, still wearing surgical scrubs, exhaustion evident in the set of his shoulders. But when he saw Sangmin, he nodded. She's stable, Hyunwoo reported. 3 broken ribs, significant bruising, mild concussion. She'll need time to heal, but she's going to survive. The tension that had been coiling in Sangmin's chest loosened fractionally. Sarah let out a sob of pure relief and, without warning, threw her arms around Sangmin's waist. The bodyguards positioned around the clinic went rigid with shock. No one touched Sangmin, ever. Not without explicit permission. Certainly not with such spontaneous, unguarded affection. But Sangmin didn't push her away. Instead, his large hand came to rest gently on the child's tangled hair, and for the first time in decades, he felt something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. Something that felt dangerously like the person he'd been before the world taught him that caring was weakness. After a moment, Sarah pulled back and wiped her eyes. Can I see her? Soon, Hyunwoo promised. She's resting now. Sangmin stood, and the warmth evaporated as quickly as it had come. His expression shifted back into something harder, colder, more familiar. The crime boss reassembling himself piece by piece. He stepped into the hallway, away from Sarah's earshot, and pulled out his phone. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made hardened criminals nervous. Bring Sang-ho and Young-min to the warehouse. Alive. I want to have a conversation with them about their business practices. The hunt had begun. The warehouse on the edge of the industrial district was the kind of place where secrets went to die. Concrete walls thick enough to swallow screams. No windows. No witnesses. Just empty space and the particular silence that came from knowing what happened here never saw daylight. Sang-ho and Young-min were dragged through the metal door by Sangmin's men, their earlier arrogance stripped away the moment they'd been pulled from their favorite bar. They'd been laughing about their evening's work, boasting about teaching that stubborn flower vendor a lesson, when hands grabbed them from behind and the world went dark. Now they knelt on the cold concrete floor, hands zip-tied behind their backs, the smug confidence that came from bullying women replaced by the primal fear of realizing they'd crossed the wrong person. They knew who Sangmin was. Everyone did. But they'd never expected to meet him like this. Sangmin entered slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. He'd changed clothes, the expensive suit replaced by darker, simpler attire. But his presence filled the warehouse just the same, a gravitational force that made the air feel heavier. He walked in a slow circle around the two kneeling men, studying them the way a scientist might examine specimens under glass. Cataloging. Measuring. Finding them wanting. Do you know why you're here? Sang-min asked conversationally. Sang-ho, the one with the snake tattoo, tried to maintain some shred of dignity. Look, boss, if this is about territory, we can work something out. Territory? Sang-min stopped walking. You think this is about territory? He reached into his jacket and pulled out Sarah's drawing, the crayon picture of her mother surrounded by flowers. He unfolded it carefully and held it up so both men could see. This was drawn by a 7-year-old girl tonight, Sang-min said quietly. While her mother was in surgery. While she waited to find out if she'd become an orphan because 2 grown men decided $67 was worth beating a woman unconscious. Young-min, the one with red shoes now scuffed and dirty, began to sweat visibly. We didn't know. Didn't know what? Sang-min's voice cut like a blade. Didn't know the child was watching? Didn't know mothers bleed when you hit them? Didn't know that terror has a face, and tonight it looked exactly like this little girl running through the rain, desperate enough to beg a stranger for help? The warehouse fell into absolute silence. Sang-min folded the drawing and returned it to his pocket. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to confess, on camera, to every illegal loan operation you've run in this district. Every vendor you've extorted. Every family you've terrorized. One of Sang-min's men stepped forward with a camera and recording equipment. And then, Sang-min continued, you're going to provide a complete ledger of every cent you've stolen. Names. Amounts. Dates. That's impossible, Sang-ho whispered. We don't keep records like that. Sang-min crouched down until they were eye level. Then you'll reconstruct them from memory. Because every single person you've victimized is getting their money back. Starting tonight. Young-min's voice cracked. We don't have that kind of cash. Sell your cars. Sell your jewelry. Sell whatever you need to sell, Sang-min said flatly. But those people are getting paid. Every single one. He stood again, towering over them. And after that, you disappear from this district. Forever. I don't want to see your faces. I don't want to hear your names. You become ghosts. Please, Sang-ho begged, all pretense of toughness evaporating. We'll do whatever you want. Just let us stay. The woman you beat tonight sells flowers to pay rent, Sang-min interrupted. Her daughter draws pictures while waiting to see if her mother will survive. And you want mercy? Both men nodded desperately, tears mixing with sweat on their faces. Sang-min's expression didn't change. You should have thought about mercy when you were kicking a defenseless woman in an alley. Start talking. The camera's recording. The confessions took 3 hours. Every illegal loan. Every shakedown. Every act of intimidation and violence, catalogued in trembling voices while Sang-min's men documented everything. When dawn broke over Seoul, an anonymous package arrived at the central police station. Inside, recorded confessions, detailed financial records, and evidence linking Sang-ho and Young-min to dozens of illegal operations. By sunrise, both men were in custody. Their reign of petty terror ended not by violence, but by the one thing they'd never expected, justice. Sang-min stood alone in the empty warehouse as his men cleaned up and prepared to leave. The concrete floor showed no signs of what had transpired here. No blood. No bodies. Just 2 criminals removed from the streets through channels that would actually hold them accountable. But he felt no victory. No satisfaction in the exercise of power. Instead, he felt the weight of Sarah's drawing in his pocket. The memory of a little girl's desperate plea. The responsibility of being the person someone turned to when the world became too cruel to bear alone. For 20 years, he'd used his power to build an empire. Tonight, for the first time, he'd used it to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. And somehow, that felt heavier than anything he'd ever done before. More important. More true. Sang-min pulled out his phone and made one final call. Hyun-woo. How's the patient? Awake. Asking for her daughter. Good, Sang-min said quietly. I'm on my way. Morning light filtered through the clinic windows, soft and golden, when Funk's eyes finally opened fully for the first time in 2 days. The world came back in pieces: white ceiling tiles, the steady beep of monitors, the antiseptic smell of medicine and clean sheets. And Sarah. Her daughter sat curled in the chair beside the bed, still wearing the yellow dress someone had tried to clean, though the stains remained. Her small hand rested on the edge of the mattress, as if maintaining physical contact even in sleep. Baby. Funk's voice came out as barely a whisper, throat raw and painful. Sarah's eyes snapped open. For one heartbeat she simply stared, as if afraid her mother might disappear. Then she launched herself forward, careful of the 4 lines and bandages, and pressed her face against Funk's shoulder. Mama, mama, mama. The word became a prayer, repeated between sobs of relief. Funk wrapped her one good arm around her daughter, tears streaming down her own bruised face. I'm here, sweet girl. I'm here. I thought you were going to die, Sarah choked out. There was so much blood, and you wouldn't wake up, and I didn't know what to do. Shoo. You did exactly right. Funk stroked her daughter's tangled hair. You were so brave. I found help, Sarah said, pulling back just enough to look at her mother. A man named Sang-min. He saved you, Mama. He saved both of us. Funk's body tensed at the name. Even through the fog of pain medication, she recognized it. Everyone in their district knew Sang-min's name. Knew what he was. What he did. The crime boss? Funk whispered, a new kind of fear creeping into her voice. Sarah, what does he want from us? The door opened before Sarah could answer. Sang-min entered quietly, carrying a paper bag that smelled like fresh bread and soup. He stopped when he saw Funk was awake, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Funk, he said with a slight nod. I'm glad to see you're recovering. Funk instinctively pulled Sarah closer, her protective instincts overriding rational thought. What do you want? We don't have money. We can't pay. I don't want payment, Sang-min interrupted gently. He set the bag on the side table. I want you to eat something. Both of you. Confusion flickered across Funk's face. This wasn't how these things worked. In her experience, men like Sang-min always wanted something. I don't understand, she said carefully. Sang-min pulled up a chair and sat down, maintaining a respectful distance. Your daughter ran into my restaurant crying for help. She asked me to save her mother. So I did. He paused. That's all there is to understand. But you're... Funk trailed off, unsure how to finish without giving offense. A criminal? Sang-min finished for her. Yes. But not all monsters choose to stay monsters. Sometimes we just need to be reminded we're still human. The days that followed established an unexpected routine. Sarah suffered nightmares every night, violent, screaming terrors that had nurses rushing to her temporary room in the clinic. She would wake up crying, reliving the moment the men hurt her mother, seeing red shoes and snake tattoos in every shadow. Sang-min found himself staying later each evening, sitting quietly in the corner while Funk comforted her daughter. His presence, somehow, helped. Sarah would look over, see him there, solid and powerful and protective, and slowly calm down. He brought small comforts. Coloring paper and new crayons appeared on the second day. Warm meals from restaurants that served food Funk could actually afford to feed Sarah normally. Children's books in both Korean and English. You don't have to do this, Funk said one afternoon, watching Sang-min help Sarah with a coloring page. I know, he replied simply. Then why? Sang-min was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on Sarah's careful coloring strokes. Because once, a long time ago, I was a child who needed help and no one came. Maybe I'm trying to rewrite that ending. Funk studied this dangerous man who'd somehow become their protector. What happened to you? Life, Sangmin said. The same thing that happens to everyone. But I chose to become hard instead of kind. I'm starting to think that was a mistake. Sarah looked up from her drawing, a picture of 3 people holding hands under a bright sun. You're not hard, Mr. Sangmin. You're just pretending. Something in the crime boss's expression cracked, just for a moment. Then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his face into something younger, less burdened. Maybe you're right, Sarah. 2 weeks later, the doctors cleared Funk for discharge. Sangmin arranged transportation, a comfortable car, not the intimidating black sedans his men usually drove. They pulled up to the flower stall in mid-afternoon. Sarah went quiet when she saw it. The shattered windows. The destroyed displays. The sign hanging crooked and broken. Everything her mother had built, reduced to debris and bad memories. Funk's hand went to her mouth, tears threatening again. But Sangmin stepped out of the car and looked at the destruction with the calculating gaze of a man who solved problems for a living. 2 weeks, he said quietly. Give me 2 weeks. For what? Funk whispered. Sangmin turned to face them, and in his eyes was something new. Something that looked almost like purpose. To make this right. 2 weeks later, the entire neighborhood gathered on the corner where Funk's flower stall had once stood broken and destroyed. But no one could recognize it anymore. Where there had been shattered glass and splintered wood, now stood a modern flower shop with floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the afternoon sunlight and made it dance. The sign above the door, Elena's Garden, gleamed in elegant script, painted in colors that reminded Sarah of her mother's favorite flowers. Inside, through those sparkling windows, the neighbors could see refrigeration units humming quietly, keeping roses and lilies fresh. Professional display cases lined the walls. A proper counter with a cash register. Even a small workspace in the back where Funk could arrange bouquets without kneeling on concrete. The entire transformation had happened while Funk and Sarah stayed at a temporary apartment Sangmin had arranged. They'd known something was being built, but he'd refused to let them see it until today. Now Funk stood before her new shop, one hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her healing face. Her bruises had faded to yellow and green, the physical wounds closing even as the emotional ones remained raw. This is... I can't. She couldn't find words big enough. Sangmin stood beside her, holding a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. He wasn't wearing his usual dark suits today. Instead, he'd chosen something simpler, less intimidating. As if trying to be just a man, not a crime boss. Sarah, he called gently. Come here. The little girl approached, her yellow dress replaced by a new one, still yellow, still cheerful, but without the stains of that terrible night. Sangmin handed her the scissors. You were brave enough to save your mother, he said. Now you get to open her new beginning. A red ribbon stretched across the shop's entrance. The neighbors pressed closer, phones out, capturing this impossible moment. The feared Korean underworld boss, kneeling beside a 7-year-old girl, helping her cut a ribbon for a flower shop. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the scissors. Together, she asked, looking up at Sangmin. Together, he confirmed. The scissors cut through silk, and the ribbon fell away. The crowd erupted in applause, genuine, relieved, grateful applause from people who'd lived too long under the shadow of men who took instead of gave. Funk wrapped Sarah in a hug, both of them crying now. The neighbors crowded forward, touching the windows, marveling at the transformation, whispering about what this meant. Sangmin raised a hand, and the crowd quieted instantly. That was the thing about power, even when wielded gently, it commanded attention. I want to make something clear, he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. This district, from the subway station to the market, from the school to the park, is now a protection-free zone. Murmurs rippled through the audience. No gang will operate here, Sangmin continued. No loan sharks. No extortion. No one will be hurt for trying to make an honest living. His gaze swept across the faces before him, many showing years of fear and exhaustion. Anyone caught exploiting vendors or families in this neighborhood will answer directly to me. The silence that followed was profound. People looked at each other, afraid to believe what they were hearing. Protection-free zones didn't exist in their world. There was always someone demanding payment, always someone taking their cut. But Sangmin's reputation made the promise real. If he said it, it would happen. An elderly vegetable vendor stepped forward, her weathered hands clasped together. Why? She asked simply. Why would you do this? Sangmin was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled Sarah's first drawing from his jacket pocket, the one she'd made in the hospital, now carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. He held it up so everyone could see the simple crayon image of a mother and daughter surrounded by flowers. Because this little girl taught me something I'd forgotten, he said. Power should protect the weak, not feed on them. He looked at Funk, then at Sarah, then back at the crowd. For too long, I used my influence to control. To make people afraid. But fear isn't strength. It's just another form of weakness. He gestured to the flower shop. This is what strength looks like. Building instead of destroying. Protecting instead of threatening. Giving people the chance to live without looking over their shoulders. The crowd stood in stunned silence, processing this transformation. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Soon the entire neighborhood was applauding, some crying, others embracing, all of them feeling something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Later, after the crowd dispersed and Funk was inside organizing her new inventory with trembling, grateful hands, Sarah tugged on Sangmin's sleeve. He looked down at the little girl who'd changed everything. Thank you, Uncle Sangmin, she whispered. The title hit him harder than any weapon ever had. Uncle. Family. Belonging. Sangmin knelt down and pulled Sarah into a gentle hug. Thank you, Sarah. For being brave enough to ask for help. Are you going to visit us? She asked, pulling back to look at his face. After today? Sangmin smiled, that real smile that was becoming easier each time. Every Tuesday evening. If that's okay with your mother. Sarah beamed. I'll draw you pictures. I'd like that very much. As Sangmin stood and walked toward his car, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Not power. Not fear. Not even satisfaction. Just the quiet warmth of being needed for something good. Of choosing, finally, to be the help that comes instead of the danger people run from. Tuesday evenings became sacred. Like clockwork, Sangmin's black sedan would pull up outside Elena's garden at exactly 6 o'clock. He'd step out, usually still in his work clothes, the dark suits and gold chain that marked him as what he was, but the moment he crossed the threshold of the flower shop, something shifted. The crime boss would fade, and something softer would emerge. Funk learned to prepare tea at 5:45. Nothing fancy, just the simple jasmine blend Sarah loved, served in mismatched cups that had survived the attack. They'd sit at the small tables Sangmin had included in the shop's design, surrounded by the perfume of roses and chrysanthemums, and talk about ordinary things. How Sarah's math grades were improving. Whether the new refrigeration unit was keeping the orchids fresh enough. Which neighbors had stopped by with gratitude they could barely articulate. Normal things. Human things. Things Sangmin hadn't discussed in decades. She got a gold star today, Funk said one Tuesday, pouring tea with hands that had finally stopped shaking. For her reading comprehension. Sangmin smiled, watching Sarah in the corner where she was carefully arranging a bouquet of daisies. She's brilliant. Takes after her mother. Funk shook her head. She takes after someone who showed her that asking for help isn't weakness. That's you, Sangmin. He looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what anyone should have done. But no one else did, Funk said quietly. Only you. Sarah would show him her drawings, elaborate scenes that grew more complex each week. She'd graduated from simple stick figures to detailed landscapes. Her favorite subject remained the same, though: 3 people holding hands. A mother. A daughter. And a tall man in a green suit. "This is us at the park," Sarah explained one evening, spreading her latest creation across the table. "See? That's you pushing me on the swing." "I've never pushed you on a swing," Sang-min pointed out gently. Sarah looked up at him with those impossibly earnest eyes. "Not yet. But maybe you will." The next Sunday, Sang-min found himself at the park, his expensive suit jacket draped over a bench, pushing a 7-year-old girl on a swing while she shrieked with laughter. His bodyguards maintained a discreet perimeter, looking thoroughly confused by this development. The changes didn't go unnoticed. His men whispered among themselves during strategy meetings. The boss who once conducted business with surgical coldness now sometimes smiled during phone calls. The man who'd never shown mercy now inquired about the families of his employees, asking if their children needed school supplies or if aging parents required medical care. "He's going soft," some muttered in dark corners. But those closest to Sang-min, the ones who'd served him longest, saw something different. He wasn't weaker. His decisions remained sharp, his authority unchallenged. If anything, he'd become more formidable because he no longer operated from a place of buried pain and defensive brutality. He'd become freer. The city noticed too. Rumors spread through Seoul's underworld like wildfire. The infamous Sang-min, transformed by a child's tears. Some saw it as weakness to exploit. Those foolish enough to test that theory learned quickly that compassion and ruthlessness could coexist in the same man. He simply chose his targets more carefully now. Behind the flower shop, Sang-min helped create a small garden. Nothing elaborate, just a patch of earth where Sarah could plant seeds and watch things grow. He'd kneel in the dirt in his expensive trousers, showing her how to space bulbs properly, his gold chain catching the late afternoon sun. "Why do you wear that?" Sarah asked one day, pointing to the chain. "To remind people who I am," Sang-min said. "But we already know who you are," Sarah replied with a child's simple logic. "Your Uncle Sang-min who helps flowers grow." He laughed, a real, unguarded sound that startled even himself. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? 20 years? 30? Funk watched from the shop window, a soft smile on her face. This dangerous man, kneeling in dirt with her daughter, discussing the proper depth for planting cosmos seeds. It was absurd. Impossible. And yet, here they were. One Tuesday evening, as Sang-min prepared to leave, Sarah approached him with a folded piece of paper. She'd been working on it all week, hiding it whenever he looked over. "This is for you," she said shyly. "To keep in your pocket. Like the first one." Sang-min unfolded it carefully. The drawing showed 3 people holding hands under a bright sun. But this time, Sarah had added words at the top in her careful, practiced handwriting. "Thank you for saving my family." And at the bottom, in smaller letters, "You saved yourself too." Sang-min stared at those words for a long moment, something tightening in his chest. This child, this brave, impossible child, had seen through everything. Past the suits and the reputation and the carefully constructed walls. She'd seen the truth. He'd spent 20 years building an empire to fill the emptiness where his humanity used to be. And a 7-year-old girl had shown him that the emptiness was a choice he'd made, not a permanent condition. Sang-min folded the drawing and placed it in his pocket, right next to the first one. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly. She hugged him goodnight, as she always did now. And Sang-min hugged her back, as he was learning to do. Sang-min sat alone in his car for 10 minutes after leaving the flower shop that Tuesday evening. The driver knew better than to ask questions. The bodyguards maintained their usual silence. But all of them noticed their boss wasn't moving, wasn't reaching for his phone, wasn't barking orders or reviewing documents. He was just sitting, staring at a piece of paper in his hands. Sarah's latest drawing. In the dim interior light, the crayon colors seemed to glow. 3 figures holding hands, a woman in a simple dress, a small girl with a bright smile, and a tall man in a green suit. The sun above them was yellow and cheerful, surrounded by flowers that Sarah had drawn with painstaking detail. But it was the words that had shattered something inside him. "Thank you for saving my family." Sangmin's hand trembled slightly as he traced the careful letters. Sarah had practiced her handwriting, he could tell. Each character deliberate and earnest, written with the kind of sincerity only children possessed. Then his eyes fell to the second line, smaller but somehow heavier. "You saved yourself too." A single tear slid down Sangmin's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Couldn't, really. Because more followed, silent, unexpected, unstoppable. Decades of carefully controlled emotion cracking open like a dam that had finally reached its breaking point. When was the last time he'd cried? He couldn't remember. Sometime before the streets had taught him that tears were dangerous. Before he'd learned to bury everything soft under layers of violence and calculated ruthlessness. He remembered the man he'd been at 25. Hungry. Desperate. Willing to do whatever it took to climb out of poverty and powerlessness. He remembered his first collection job, his first intimidation, his first time watching someone beg and choosing to ignore it. Each choice had seemed necessary at the time. Survival. Strategy. The way the world worked. He remembered building his empire one brutal decision at a time. Reputation earned through fear. Respect demanded through violence. Power accumulated by being willing to do what others wouldn't. He'd told himself it was strength. That caring made you vulnerable. That the only way to survive was to become harder than everyone else. And he'd been so convinced he was right. Until a 7-year-old girl in a dirty yellow dress had grabbed his sleeve and asked for help. Until he'd knelt beside a bleeding woman in an alley and felt something he thought he'd killed years ago, the desire to protect instead of dominate. Until he'd sat in a hospital waiting room with a frightened child and remembered that once, he'd been that child. Powerless. Desperate. Hoping someone strong would choose to be kind. The contrast was staggering. 20 years of violence and intimidation, of taking and controlling and making people fear his name. Versus 6 weeks of Tuesday evening tea. Of children's drawings and flower gardens. Of laughter that came easier each time. Which version of himself was the real one? Sangmin looked at Sarah's drawing again and realized the answer. Both were real. The question wasn't which one was true, it was which one he chose to be going forward. A soft knock on the car window startled him. Funk stood outside, a light shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. Sangmin quickly wiped his face and opened the door. "I'm sorry," Funk said. "I saw you sitting here and, are you all right?" He should have lied. Should have maintained the image. But something about this woman, who'd survived her own trauma and still chose gentleness, made honesty feel safer than pretense. "Sarah's drawing," he said quietly, showing it to her. Funk looked at it and smiled softly. She worked on it all week. Wanted it to be perfect. "It is," Sangmin said. "It's..." He trailed off, unable to find words adequate to describe what he felt. Funk sat in the passenger seat uninvited, closing the door against the cold. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, two people who'd been broken by violence and were learning, slowly, how to be whole again. "You know what she told me?" Funk said finally. "She said you were sad before you met us. That you tried to hide it, but she could see it in your eyes." Sangmin's jaw tightened. "She's perceptive." "She's right," Funk corrected gently. "I see it too. Or I saw it, past tense. You're different now. Is that good or bad?" "It's human," Funk said. "Which is the best thing any of us can be." Sangmin looked at her, this woman who should hate men like him, who had every reason to fear his world, who'd been victimized by the very system he'd helped build. And yet she sat beside him with compassion instead of judgment. "I spent 20 years convinced that caring was weakness," he admitted. That power came from being willing to be cruel. And now? Now I think maybe the bravest thing I've ever done was let a little girl hug me. Funk reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. Thank you, Sang-min. For everything. For saving us. For staying. For being the person Sarah needed you to be. She saved me too, Sang-min said quietly. More than she'll ever know. Funk smiled and left the car, walking back toward the flower shop where Sarah was probably already asleep in their small apartment upstairs. Sang-min sat alone again, but the solitude felt different now. Less like isolation and more like peace. He carefully folded Sarah's drawing and placed it in his wallet, next to the first one she'd given him in the hospital. 2 pieces of paper. Crayon and hope. They weighed nothing. And yet they carried everything that mattered. The driver finally spoke. Home, boss? Sang-min looked out at the flower shop, its lights warm against the Seoul night. Yes, he said. Home. But for the first time in decades, he wasn't entirely sure which place he meant. 6 months had passed since that rainy night when a little girl in a yellow dress had changed everything. Elena's garden stood proudly on the corner now, its windows catching the afternoon sun and scattering light across the sidewalk like scattered petals. Inside, refrigerated cases held roses in every shade, crimson, blush, ivory, gold. Chrysanthemums lined the shelves. Orchids hung in delicate arrangements near the window where they could catch the best light. And behind the counter, Funk smiled. Not the exhausted, fearful smile of someone barely surviving. But a real smile. The kind that reached her eyes and made the healing scars on her face seem less like reminders of trauma and more like proof of survival. She was arranging a wedding bouquet, white lilies and baby's breath, when the elderly vegetable vendor from down the street stopped by with her grandson. For my sister's birthday, the woman said, counting out careful bills. She loves yellow flowers. Funk assembled a cheerful arrangement of sunflowers and daisies, adding extra blooms without charging for them. She could afford to be generous now. The shop thrived in ways she'd never dared dream possible. And the neighborhood had changed too. No more loan sharks lurking on corners. No more threatening visits demanding protection money. No more fear etched into the faces of shopkeepers who were just trying to feed their families. Sang-min's promise had held. The district remained a protection-free zone, guarded by a reputation that made even the boldest criminals think twice. Outside, in the small garden behind the shop, Sarah played freely. She'd planted cosmos seeds 2 months ago, and now they bloomed in wild profusion, pink and white and magenta, dancing in the breeze. She moved among them with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd learned she could trust the world again. Her nightmares had faded. The fear that made her flinch at loud footsteps had gradually dissolved. She laughed easily now, played with neighborhood children, drew pictures that no longer featured men with snake tattoos and red shoes. Instead, her drawings showed gardens and sunshine. Families holding hands. Hope rendered in crayon and imagination. The yellow dress from that terrible night had been retired, replaced by a wardrobe of bright colors that reflected the light returning to her young life. At exactly 6 o'clock, a familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb. Sang-min stepped out, and Sarah immediately abandoned her flowers to run toward him. Uncle Sang-min. Come see. The cosmos bloomed. He let himself be dragged to the garden, genuinely interested in the flowers they'd planted together. His expensive suit would get dirty kneeling in the earth. His gold chain would catch on branches. His bodyguards would maintain their perimeter with expressions that suggested they still couldn't quite believe this was their job now. But none of that mattered. Funk brought out tea. Sarah showed off her latest drawing. They sat together in the fading golden light, 3 people who'd found family in the most unexpected way. The city still whispered about them. About the night the most feared Korean crime boss had been brought to his knees by a child's tears. Some called it weakness. Others called it impossibility. But those who truly understood, the vendors in that protected district, the families who could finally save money instead of paying extortion, the children who played without fear, they called it something else. They called it redemption. Sangmin had built an empire through ruthlessness and fear. He'd climbed to power over the broken bodies of anyone who stood in his way. For 20 years, he'd been exactly what the world expected: cold, calculating, untouchable. And then a 7-year-old girl had grabbed his sleeve and asked for help. That was all it took. Not a rival gang's challenge. Not police pressure. Not some elaborate scheme or violent confrontation. Just one small voice, trembling with desperation and hope, refusing to accept that the world had to be cruel. Sarah had reminded Sangmin of something he'd forgotten, that power without compassion was just another form of poverty. That fear without love was just another kind of death. That being untouchable meant being utterly, completely alone. She'd shown him that the strongest thing a person could do wasn't to build higher walls, it was to open the door and let someone in. As twilight settled over Seoul, Sarah leaned against Sangmin's shoulder while he helped her color a new drawing. Funk hummed softly behind the counter, arranging tomorrow's displays. The flower shop glowed warm against the gathering darkness, a beacon of something rare and precious. Peace. Safety. Family. The world still turned. Crime still existed. Violence still happened in dark corners of the city. Sangmin still ran his empire, still made hard decisions, still carried the weight of his reputation. But now he also carried something else, the knowledge that even the darkest heart could choose light. That redemption wasn't earned through grand gestures but through small, daily choices to be better than you were yesterday. That sometimes, the loudest revolution doesn't begin with guns or money or power. Sometimes it begins with a trembling child whispering, "Please help my mom." And if the person who hears that plea chooses compassion over indifference, kindness over cruelty, love over fear, then everything changes. Not just for the child, but for everyone. Before you go, if this story touched you even a little, don't leave without subscribing. It really helps this channel grow. Thank you.